Right, here we are talking about coaching. I'm here with Nicki and Yannick. Today we have a question and says, what if my client needs therapy? What if my coaching clients need therapy? This is a very interesting question. What are your thoughts on that?
Ooh.
It's a big one for Yannick, I reckon.
Have you? Yeah, well, I've been interested in the line or the blurry space, the gray area between coaching and therapy for many years. It's something that keeps coming up as a question for people. It's like, how far can I go as a coach? You know, it's interesting the way that the question was phrased. The question was quased about, does my client need therapy? Because that implies that me as a coach or as a practitioner make some sort of assumption or judgment about what my client needs. So it'll be super interesting to talk to the person who asked the question and said like, well, explore that a bit, you know? Because what does it mean to need therapy? Does it mean me as a coach, I don't have the skills to give you what you want? Because therapy and coaching, they're not very clearly defined. You know, there's a big gray area. Some coaches I've met, they're clearly therapists who call themselves coaches. You know, some therapists that do some coaching work, but coaching is such a broad range of what it can be. It's difficult to say you need this or you need that. What we can explore is, you as a client, like, first of all, what made me consider that my coaching client needs therapy? Is that a level of depth that I cannot provide, or is that because they want to explore the past and their relationships with their parents that I feel I don't want to do as a coach, or I don't consider coaching? Is it because this is not a behavioral problem, this is like a character transformation that they're looking for? Or perhaps is it about the client? Do I feel that the client is broken and needs fixing? And I believe that's not what coaching provide. You know, because often coaches work with people who are resourceful and whole, as we say, you know, and they already have the resources. So we just work forward, you know, present to the future. So these are like all good starting points, but not necessarily definitive definitions of what a coach can and can't do. Because I met some coaches, they provide very deep work. And I also do on occasion explore relationships in the past and how certain thought patterns were formed. You know, sometimes I ask questions and I always hesitate a slight bit when I ask, well, we identified these thought patterns that you have, and they really hinder you from reaching your goals and doing what you want to do. You know, there's these ruminations or like, you know, negative self-talk, inner critics. And I often do ask, well, often these are formed during our childhood or because of past experiences. You know, you might get fired from a job and now you're super careful about taking risks. So I often explore stuff in the past, not necessarily trying to resolve them, but acknowledging them and seeing how far does the client understand the relationships and the dynamics and how they were formed. You know, who are you now and how did you come to be that person? And then at that point I have this analogy of, well, we just discovered, imagine you work with somebody who wants to run a marathon, and all of a sudden we identify this massive gash, this wound that goes deep to the bone, and perhaps there's a bone fracture. And at that point you're like, well, I'm not a bone doctor, you know. Maybe it's not that bad, but it's gonna hurt when you run. You know, but maybe you can push through that. We can acknowledge that there's an injury, but maybe you can still run a marathon. It's just going to be harder than for people who have very healthy legs. You know, I have some bandages we can put around as a coach, but if you wanted to address the bone fracture or the wound, you know, then you need to go to a person that specializes in those kind of thing. I just don't do that kind of work, you know, and then they would need a therapist if they decided to do that, you know, and depending on the nature of the wound, that might be absolutely necessary because they can barely walk, or maybe it's not necessary. And some clients tell me, it's like, yeah, I kind of know if I really want to resolve this at the core, I would need to go to somebody weekly and really process it and go back and feel all the pain again and make sense of it and change the meanings around that. I'm not ready to do that. I don't want to do that. I'd rather bear some of the pain in some of the situations that I'm in and just push through it. You know, and then it's up to the client, you know. Does your client need therapy? Does your client want therapy? And am I willing and able to give the client what they need.
Okay. Yeah, I think on the last sort of what you said, it's making me think like it's okay to speak up and kind of maybe reflect to the client an acknowledgement that you're noticing that you're breaching some topics that kind of are at the boundaries between coaching and therapy, and just make your feeling about it known if you're noticing your own discomfort in that situation. But like you say, kind of give them the option of choosing and deciding for themselves and empowering them back. So it's kind of keeping up the
assumption that they make their own decisions. No?
Exactly. The coaching relationship in the way we understand it now. Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, yeah, I think as coaches we just sometimes need to be careful where we go, and I think it's really listening to your own intuition. If I feel I'm out of my depth, I'll just probably stop. But I've had times where it felt like, oh, this is going very deep, but then I trusted the person in front of me and I just hold space. And the client was crying for half an hour
Wow.
through the story, and then after that they actually took ownership. And it wasn't that they didn't need to actually go there too much, and they didn't need the healing process. They actually the talking and sharing was part of that process.
But isn't that the healing process? I mean, I'm just
Yeah,
putting
I
myself
guess
into
so,
that situation. I'm like, if my client would cry for longer than 10 minutes, 10 minutes is a lot of crying. You know, I would feel that's definitely therapy right now.
Yeah.
I mean, you're still holding space, that's still...
It was very uncomfortable, and to be honest, for me it was about like, okay, I don't want to just interrupt the process here, but something in me said like, hey, so when she was done, I said, okay, what would you like to create going forward, right? So part of me was
very much
like
a coaching
in
question.
that whatever time it was, maybe it was actually 15-20 minutes, but it seemed like forever, right? In that time period I thought, well, what am I gonna do? I'm gonna say, are you okay? I feel sorry for you. But then I just hold space and then came back to the presence. And I think in that moment there was, again, seeing the person, right? It kind of gave me a feeling that she's okay with it, right? And then we went to that coaching question and she said, okay, enough is enough. I want this change going forward.
Right.
And I think that was really powerful. And at times, this has happened where I just managed to hold space and actually we didn't need to go into therapy. But it's again really being aware of your assumptions and maybe bringing it up into coaching or supervision.
Yeah, and if the question is if the client wants to engage with it, because that was a coaching question, like what do you want to create going forward? If she were not able to engage with that question going forward, thinking forward, if there's still stuff she needs to get off her chest or work through some of the pain, sometimes we just need to sit in that pain in order for it to heal and just voice it. And I think that's when the coach needs to make a decision whether that's coaching or not for them. And I think most coaches will probably decide if somebody just needs to kind of process stuff and we don't know what we're working towards, in the future, then maybe that's not coaching. Maybe that'd be in better hands with somebody who's professionally trained to hold space all the time. Because we, as coaches, we do hold space, we do create space, but also we're working with the process and we're moving forward. And then there's a whole nother conversation which we'll probably do in a different one of these episodes, is about once you decide whether that perhaps therapy or counseling or psychoanalysis or perhaps even mentoring or consulting or just going to see a friend, like if anything else but the coaching space that you create, if they need something else, if you're unable or unwilling to provide what they need right now, then you need to have that conversation, and refer them or suggest that perhaps this is not the best space to work on what they want to work on. And that's how to have that referral conversation. That's a really important topic, and I think that would go too far right now.
Yeah, I think that's very important. I think it's partially putting our ego aside, but coming from a non-judgmental place. And sometimes actually being very transparent and asking them, have you considered therapy? Because I've had this once where
You want to be careful with that though, because if you ask that, it can sound like you need therapy. You know, and some people really don't want to hear that. And some people, regardless whether they might need it or not, you know, somebody might just hear, oh, you think I'm crazy? Or you think I'm broken? And so with that kind of question, we need to be very careful. I think sometimes it's very appropriate and we need to read the situation, but also there's risks in asking that question, you know what I mean?
Yeah, good point.
So yeah, it can be tricky, because what we don't want to do is make that person feel like they're being rejected in a moment where they're very vulnerable and fragile. Because in that moment where we ask ourselves the question, does that person need therapy? Probably we've identified something, we touched on something, like something came up that made us question that. Or perhaps the client is asking, oh, maybe I should see a therapist. You know, that means they're really fragile, and at that moment we have a duty of care, and we need to be quite careful how we tread, you know, as coaches. Because we don't want to make them feel rejected, because that often is part of why they need therapy, or why they feel they need therapy, or why we might feel they need therapy. We want to care for them, we want to make sure that they're in good hands, but at the same time, we also might not want to work with them, because that would even be more riskier. You know, because we might not have the skills, especially at the beginning of our coaching journey, we might just not have the skills to hold that space. You know, some people have that naturally, and they're naturally very empathetic, and they make somebody feel good. But if you think about the kind of extreme end of the performance coaching spectrum, and somebody has a bit of a mental breakdown or emotional breakdown, and they start crying, you know, you just like, well, grow model? So, okay, so you want to not be crying. What's the current reality? You are crying. It's like, oh no, this stuff doesn't work.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, and I think it's also maybe the distinction is about realizing, well, it's, yes, you want to come from a place of love and care, but the person is not necessarily your responsibility. It's not like, oh, I need to save this person, right? Often as coaches we think like, you know, we're saviors, so we need to, people are our responsibility.
Yeah.
And I think it's just getting a fine line there.
Yeah, imagine you go see a doctor, and then you want to discuss your relationship problems. That doctor will tell you, I don't do that kind of work.
Yeah.
You know, and if they start breaking down and crying, the doctor still doesn't do that kind of work. But they might refer you to somebody, or help you see somebody else who might deal with that kind of stuff. You know, you have a duty of care. Hey, are you alright? Do you have people to talk to? But you don't have to take the responsibility to give the client everything that they need, even though we might deeply care and really want to give them everything they need. We can't be everything for everybody. So I hope that was helpful for you guys, and send us your questions. We're always interested in having more of your questions and discussing them for future episodes. And I'd also be really interested if you were in scenarios where you weren't quite sure whether you need to refer somebody or not. Without breaking confidentiality, of course, I'd be really interested to hear about some of these stories and the thoughts that you had based on our conversation. Let's continue that, because we're here to talk about coaching, and that includes you. So see you next time. Hey guys, if you enjoyed that, you know what to do. Hit subscribe and send us a question. See you next time.